Hello, my name is Andrea Lorenzo Molinari. I'm the president of the Blessed Edmund Rice School for Pastoral Ministry here in the Diocese of Venice in Florida. I'm a theologian, a Roman Catholic theologian who specializes in the New Testament literature as well as early church history, roughly the first 500 years or so. I would like to do a couple things here to begin with. One, I'd like to begin with prayer, and then two, let's have some preliminary remarks as we talk about our subject matter, which is the apocalypse and apocalyptic literature. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, well, first of all, I'm very happy to have you join me. I want to take this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite books in the Bible, the book of Revelation. Regrettably, the book of Revelation has also been the source of a great deal of consternation for the church throughout the 2,000 years that we've been aware of it. From the very beginning, there were those among the church fathers who were suspicious of the book of Revelation. It was one of the last to really be accepted. There were those who actually attributed it to the work of a heretic by the name of Cerinthus, and actually did not want it to be included in the New Testament at all. I'm glad personally that we did include it in the New Testament, despite all the trouble that it's caused over the last 2,000 years. My only regret is that I wish that the Church Fathers would have included not just one example of the genre apocalypse, but rather would have included several examples, so that it wouldn't have stood out as a sore thumb in the way I think it does in the New Testament. You're reading along in the New Testament, and you have the Gospels, and certainly they have a certain biographical feel and a certain narrative character to them, and the Acts of the Apostles continues along with that. You go into the letters and epistolary literature, and certainly one recognizes right away the application that this kind of literature has, its usefulness in the early church and why it was preserved. You get to something like the book of Hebrews, and one sees that it's clearly a theological exposition. It's a consideration of elements of the Hebrew scriptures and their application moving forward as we consider the place of Christ and Christian theology. And then you get to the book of Revelation, and most people are like, what? What is this? What is this literature that we're encountering? And we encounter great beasts and violence, quite a violent tone, frankly, in the book of Revelation. And people are left scratching their head and wondering, what is this all about? What place does this have in the place of a Christian's life in our overall outlook towards the world? And so I think that one of the most important things that I can do for you in terms of helping to walk you up to the book of Revelation and introducing you to it is to introduce you to the concept of the genre of apocalypse. And so that's really where I want to put my focus in this particular lecture, is the consideration of what is the genre apocalypse. And so let's begin with that. The first question that we might pose is, what is genre in the first place? And I have a more formal definition here up on the screen. It's a category of artistic composition, as in music or literature, characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. For example, in regard to music, one can say country western music. There are certain expectations in terms of the subject matter that one will find discussed in country western music. The same thing that one might have a specific set of expectations for rap music. There are certain characteristics of a genre that one has a certain level of expectation. Now, what I've done here, what I'm intending to do as we go forward in this lecture, is I've picked out a genre of literature, in this case, the superhero comic book, which, by the way, is only one kind of comic book. And I'm using this example of literature as a way of being able to discuss the concept of genre as a whole. And I want to demonstrate by looking at this type of literature that people do in fact have expectations that they bring when they encounter a particular type of literature or a type of music. So in other words, as I said, when one listens to country western music or, for example, rhythm and blues, one is going to expect a certain kind of thing, a certain tone from that kind of music. And it's not to say that that kind of music can't break with expectations, but when it does, it's usually very significant, and so something to pay attention to. So with that said, let's take a look at an example, the example of comic book, superhero comic books. I would like, on a personal note, to say this is an area that has always been near and dear to my heart from the time I was a child, and I still love superheroes. I'm still a geek for superheroes, I guess, but I think this will be instructive, and so I hope you'll also enjoy it as well. So let's take a look. With regard to the genre of superhero comic book, one of the expectations that we have as we approach this type of literature is that there are going to be brightly colored characters. I mean, people don't walk around in outfits like this. I think of Captain America. You know, here's a man that is carrying a large shield with a star and is wearing a huge, basically American flag on his chest. It certainly would draw attention when he walks in the room. Likewise, we have here on the left-hand side of the screen an Image comic book, one of the big four comic book producers in the United States, and one of their flagship creations called Invincible. And again, it's a perfect example of the brightly colored characters that appear in these types of books. Now, another characteristic of this genre of literature is that the characters are drawn with an exaggerated musculature. And this is a very well-known aspect of the literature. You have exaggerated muscles with regard to the men and also with the women. In fact, as a side note, a bit of humor here, finding a Wonder Woman that was appropriate for this talk was a bit of a challenge in terms of the way that they draw her is so exaggerated that it's not necessarily appropriate for our purposes. So that's just to give you an example of that aspect of this particular genre. Again, stories in this genre are told using sequential art. You cannot separate that fact from the genre superhero comic book. It is, you have a page is broken up into panels, and those panels have dialogue as well as narration, and that's how the story is presented. And the art is closely associated with telling the story or moving the story forward. One could say that the artist is telling the story along with the writer. And here we have examples of Hellboy, which is a Dark Horse production, and then of course a old standard from DC Comics, Batgirl. The other thing, and I mentioned this in the previous slide, is that in this genre of literature, narration and dialogue appear in boxes and balloons. And let me explain what I mean by this. In these, on the right-hand side, we have word balloons or dialogue balloons. And we have a couple different types here. We have the statements with the pointed end, where these are statements that are made out loud. They may be sound effects like the ow, or they may be a statement that's made by a particular character out in general, in public, or to another character. In addition, we have what are called these thought balloons, and the thought balloons have these little dots that connect them to the one who is thinking that, and so it gives the reader a certain access to the thought world of the character. In addition, if you take a look at the left-hand side of the slide here, we see narration is presented in these narration boxes. They tend to be square or rectangle in shape, and they allow the character themselves often to be able to narrate the story and to move things ahead without having to present it in dialogue form. It's a way of accelerating the story without getting bogged down in the exchange between characters. This particular scene is a famous scene from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. It's a extremely famous graphic novel, and in many think that it absolutely changed the perspective on the character of Batman from in the 1980s, and has impacted ever since. Another characteristic of this genre is often that characters' origin involve terrible tragedies. We see a couple classic examples of this. Of course, on the left-hand side, we see young Bruce Wayne kneeling in between the bodies of his slain parents, Thomas and Martha Wayne. Of course, he will grow up to become Batman as a result of that tragedy in his young life. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we see young Peter Parker getting the news that his uncle has been murdered. And it's that murder that will set him off on his career as a crime fighter, as, of course, Spider-Man. Of course, authors can play with these same expectations. And as I said earlier, when they do, it's going to matter. I want to example, this one is on the left-hand side. This is Fat Albert. This is one out of my own childhood that I have a lot of affection for. I always loved this show. This was a show that was narrated as far as I know, almost completely by Bill Cosby, the famous comedian and educator. And the character in this particular case, I believe it's a Halloween special, and he actually is dressing, Fat Albert is actually dressing up like a superhero. And of course, that physique that he has is not of the expectation of what a superhero should look like. And I think if you go back and watch the cartoon, one of the things that Bill Cosby is getting at is that he's playing with the idea of our expectations for a superhero, of what they're going to look like. And what he has Fat Albert do is perform heroic deeds. And so really the question that he raises is a superhero defined by how they look or by what they do? And that's, of course, an extremely important question that one needs to answer. On the right-hand side is a little bit more lighthearted example. This character is called the Tick. The Tick is extremely muscle-bound. Unfortunately, you can't see it in this picture. I would invite you, if you doubt me, to Google this character. But he's absolutely a dunce. He is one of the dumbest characters that you will ever encounter in comic books. He's a superhero, but he fights crime in the most ridiculous manner possible. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, his war cry is the word spoon, which leaves you scratching your head saying, why? And there really is no answer provided whatsoever, other than the fact that it's just for the comic effect of the character. All right, that's aside, let's get a little bit more serious. By looking at those examples of superhero comics, we've kind of probed into the idea of what are the expectations that a reader or an audience brings to the table when they encounter a genre of literature. And these are, as you can see, I don't think there's anything that I put up on that screen that would be surprising to anyone who's ever encountered a superhero comic book. So there clearly are, a certain set of guidelines that the literature world kind of takes for granted. Even if you yourself are not a writer of comic books, you're kind of aware of those things. And when you approach that type of literature, you have those set of expectations. Now, with regard to the genre apocalypse, we actually have in the 1970s, the Society of Biblical Literature put together a working group that was going to study apocalyptic literature. And the way they were going to do this is by reading many apocalypses from the ancient world, recognizing that apocalypses were not only written by Jews, that some of which occur in the Old Testament, also by Christians, as an example of which appears in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, but in fact, the Jewish and Christian communities wrote many other apocalypses that did not make it into our Bibles, whether the Jewish Tanakh or whether the Old and New Testament of the Christian scriptures, but yet they existed and influenced people's minds and hearts in the ancient world nonetheless. In addition to that, they recognized that apocalyptic literature was also produced by those who were not Christians at all, were not Jews, and had really little to no association with these groups other than that they shared the same ancient world. The Greeks wrote apocalypses, the Romans wrote apocalypses, the Egyptians wrote apocalypses, and other groups produced them as well. And so this working group took it upon themselves to begin to read through these different examples of the genre, and by doing so begin to formulate what were the kind of set of expectations that appear to be the case when one compares this kind of literature. And this group was produced their results in a volume that was in a work called Samaya, Volume 14, and it was called Apocalypse, the Morphology of a Genre. And that was produced in, of course, 1979. Now, I have here on the screen a husband and wife. They're both scholars. The gentleman on the left, his name is John J. Collins. He's the primary editor of the work in question that we're discussing. And then, of course, his wonderful spouse, Adela Yarbrough Collins. They're a very interesting couple on many levels, and I regard them as a personal hero and heroine. They are interesting in many regards, but in this particular case, Dr. Collins, Dr. John J. Collins, is an expert in Old Testament apocalyptic literature, both that which is found in the Hebrew scriptures themselves and Jewish apocalypses that are found elsewhere. On the other hand, his spouse, Adela Yarbrough Collins, is an expert in the book of Revelation and as well as Christian apocalypses. And it's rather interesting that John Collins wrote a commentary on the book of Daniel that was published in a series called the Hermeneia series, published by Fortress Press out of Minneapolis. And that was on the book of Daniel. And in the book itself, there was an article that was written by his wife, Adela Yarbrough Collins, on the use of Daniel in the book of Revelation, which I thought was an interesting team-up of sorts between husband and wife. They've together made incredible contributions to the study of the apocalyptic literature, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention them. Of course, this working group that we're talking about in the Society of Biblical Literature involved many scholars, and their works are collected in a series of articles that are in that volume that we discussed, Apocalypse Morphology of a Genre. Now, let's take a look at the definition that was actually produced by this working group back in 1979. Here it is. The definition that they produced is: an apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. Wow. Okay. Most people, when I read that, they give me this kind of marine 1,000-yard stare. They're like, that's really not helping me a bit. There's so many $100 words in there, or $1,000 words, whatever you want to call it, that definition tends to go right over people's head. What I'm going to try to do here is unpack that definition piece by piece, and hopefully demonstrate that it actually provides a very good way of understanding apocalyptic literature, a way that kind of opens the genre to all of us once we understand some of the big words that are used within that definition. So let's take a look at it, and we're going to tear it apart piece by piece and hopefully clarify it for you. All right, read it one more time. An apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. Okay, that said, let's begin to tear this apart. All right, the first thing is that it's revelatory literature. Simply stated, this is literature that reveals something new. If this is literature that tells you something that you already know, then it's of no use. It doesn't have any import for the audience. It presents itself as a revelation of new things, an unveiling, literally, of new things. All right? So the second thing is that it's presented in a narrative framework. It's presented in a story format. If one reads the book of Revelation from cover to cover, one notes that both in the first chapter and also in the last chapter, reference is made to the fact that this book is intended to be read out loud to the churches. It's supposed to be kind of like a circular letter, so to speak, that is sent around to the various churches in question and then presented out loud orally to that congregation. This is an extremely important point that people need to understand, that the apocalypse is presented in a narrative or story format, and so the church, the community would gather and would listen to the apocalypse as one would a story. Okay, so that cannot be overemphasized in its importance. Now, the next part is that revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being. Now, of course, when one thinks of a revelation or an apocalypse and an otherworldly being, one immediately is drawn to the right side of this screen, where we see an angel depicted. And one says, okay, in apocalyptic literature, a person, a seer or a mystic of some sort, a holy person, encounters a divine or semi-divine creature like an angel, and that angel kind of walks them through the other world and reveals to them this revelation from God. That is in many cases true, but it's not the whole story. Let me draw your attention here to the left-hand side of the screen. This is a painting called Dante and Virgil in Hell by William Adolphe Bouguereau. It was painted in roughly around the year 1850. And basically what it tries to capture is a scene from Dante's Inferno where he is made to tour basically hell. And in this particular case, you have one man and another man fighting, depicting anger. And these are people that couldn't control their anger in this life. And we see an extremely violent painting that has been depicted. That in this painting, we see one man is actually biting the neck of another. He's driven his knee into the back of the other man. And if one looks very closely, one can see that his hands have gripped the side, the rib cage of that man so strongly that they're actually drawing blood with his fingernails. So this is an extremely violent painting. So without doubt. What I would like to draw your attention to with regard to the idea of revelation being mediated by an otherworldly being is that in this particular example of the genre apocalypse, and make no mistake that Dante's Divine Comedy is most definitely an apocalypse, we have here Dante is escorted by Virgil, the famous Roman poet. Okay, why is this appropriate? Well, if one goes back and reads Virgil's Aeneid, one goes to, as one's reading along, one comes to book 6. Oh, by the way, I should back up and say, if you're not familiar with Virgil's Aeneid, first of all, I'm sorry for you, and I urge you to run right out and read that thing because it's well worth your time. But let me back this up and try to explain its context. Of course, everyone is familiar with the famous work by the Greek poet Homer. Homer writes a couple different works, the most famous of which, of course, is Homer's Iliad. And the Iliad is the famous war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Remember, this is the war that's eventually resolved by the Trojan horse. It's the gift that the Greeks give to the city of Troy. Of course, it has soldiers in it. And at night, those soldiers come out of the horse, open up the gates, and allow the Greeks to come in and destroy Troy. Now, the sequel that Homer writes to that story is called the Odyssey. And of course, that kind of catalogs and narrates the adventures of one of the Greek commanders by the name of Odysseus as he attempts to return back to his homeland. Now, the sequel, so to speak, for the Trojans is, of course, Virgil's Aeneid. And in that Aeneid, as one is reading through it, it recounts the survivors of Troy as they kind of sail around the Mediterranean looking for a new home. By the way, they'll eventually end up finding a nice little town located on this little insignificant river called the Tiber River. We'll eventually find out that that town is named Rome. And this is kind of one of the origin stories, so to speak, for the Roman people, Virgil's Aeneid. Now, the point I want to make here is that if one reads the Aeneid, one comes to book 6. In book 6, we find that we get a tour of the afterlife that involves Hades. It involves kind of a medium place that we might compare to purgatory. And then, of course, the Elysian fields, the idea of kind of a heavenly existence, is outlined in that book 6. And so it's extremely appropriate that Virgil, the one who has himself narrated a tour of the afterlife, in his book 6 of the Aeneid, should be the one who acts as the otherworldly guide to Dante in Dante's Divine Comedy. And so there is a very strong connection there in the literature and a very strong influence that is present. In addition to that, I would also like to point out that that otherworldly mediator could certainly be an angel. It could be a famous poet, as in the case of Virgil, but it can also be a person who is a heroic figure from the past. It could be somebody like Enoch. It could be somebody like Moses. In Jewish literature, one of my favorite apocalypses is actually a Roman apocalypse that you may or may not be aware of. It's called The Dream of Scipio. It's written by Cicero, who is, of course, lived in the 1st century BC in Rome, was a famous Roman senator, probably one of the most, if not the most famous Roman senator. It is his book 6 of his famous work De Republica, and this Dream of Scipio narrates a fictional dream of a Roman general by the name of Scipio Aemilianus, and the whole story is set like 2 years before the Roman defeat of Carthage, destruction of Carthage, in 146 BC. Now, in this dream that Scipio has, he's actually visited by his dead grandfather, a more famous Scipio by the name of Scipio Africanus. Scipio Africanus was also a Roman general who also battled the Carthaginians during the Second Punic War that lasted from 218 to 201 BC. And of course, it was Scipio Africanus that defeated the famous Carthaginian general by the name of Hannibal that everyone has heard of at a battle called Zama. And it would be that battle that would grant him that honorific title of Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. And so in that particular dream of Scipio, we see an example of an apocalypse where we have someone who was a human being who simply passed on before. And the key thing, of course, that they're being dead. And that being dead, they have an insider's kind of view of what the afterlife is like. So they'd be the ideal person to give you a tour of the afterlife, one who's actually been there, done that, so to speak. So I just want to kind of unpack that a little bit, help you understand that the otherworldly mediator doesn't have to be an angel at all. All right, so let's move on with this definition. When we talk about the idea of a transcendent reality, this is something that's really important. What we're really talking about when we talk about a transcendent reality is that we're really talking about what's really real, something that is more profoundly real, a better kind of bird's eye view of all reality. We as individual human beings kind of understand our little bit of reality, or at least try to understand our little bit of reality, the little square that we kind of occupy in this reality of life. But what apocalyptic literature tries to do is reveal a transcendent reality, give us a sense of the big picture. What's the big plan? You know, what is God's plan? What is the large plan of the cosmos? Even if one doesn't engage God's particular plan, as in the case of some of the Greek or Roman apocalypses, there's the attempt to kind of get a sense of the whole cosmos and its greater workings and how one fits into that larger picture, so to speak. So that's what we talk about, the idea of a transcendent reality. Now, I want to, as I do this, I want to talk about the concept of temporal, that it deals with time. Apocalypses can focus almost completely on this aspect, this idea of time, and the kind of talking about what has happened and what is yet to occur, and kind of situating the mystic or the seer, and by extension, the audience of that seer, on the kind of cosmic timeline, to give them a sense of where they are in that historical timeline, so to speak. And so that can be very much a focus of apocalyptic literature. Some apocalypses have this focus as well as the focus that we're going to look at in just a moment, but other apocalypses tend to focus on that, and we call them, historical apocalypses, where they focus on the time aspect of where we fall on the timeline. Now, what I want to talk about, we talk about the idea of temporal, and if we go back to that original definition of apocalypse, I'm going to bring it up here. I want to kind of unpack one aspect of this that I hope will be of help. As we talk about the idea of a transcendent reality, look at this. It discloses a transcendent reality which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation. All right, that's a big word, eschatological. What does it mean? Eschatos is a Greek word simply meaning last or final. Okay? So in other words, what I want to get at, when an apocalypse deals with time, history, the past, present, and future, it does so with reference to the end times. What is the end result that's desired? And in most cases, in the case of Christian or perhaps Jewish apocalypses, there's the focus on the coming reign of God. That is the end goal. That's where all history is leading to, that new age, so to speak, of where God rules the earth in the way that it should have been ruled from the very beginning. And so that's a very important idea, that when one focuses on time, one does so with regard to the end times. And we kind of have that sense, if you read through the book of Revelation, that there is very much a strong focus on, the idea of what is the end result, what is the goal towards which all of history is headed, especially from a Christian perspective. So I don't want to miss out on that opportunity to explain that word eschatological. It's a word that you're going to trip over all the time as somebody who, if you read theological literature, you're going to trip over that word all the time, and it's a big fancy schmancy word that really is quite easy to understand once one simply explains it. So, all right, let's move on and talk about the next element of this definition, which is the idea of spatial. And this definition talks about the idea that this transcendent reality is temporal, as we talked about, because in discussing its relationship to the end times. But many times the apocalypse also makes reference to a spatial revelation. In other words, it helps you understand the big picture, where we stand in the cosmos as a whole. Now, I've included here on this slide a couple different things, and I'm going to unpack them just a little bit here. The first one is the older of the two, and that's on the right-hand side. What you see there is an Egyptian, what's called cosmogony. It's the idea of what does the universe look like. And what you have there lying prone at the bottom of that picture is the earth god Geb. And then you have extended over him and larger than him is the sky goddess Nut. And those two deities produce the fecundity in the world. The idea of the sky and the earth, the moisture raining down upon the earth produces the fertility, the crops and herds and children of the people. And that's a way of understanding. Notice the shape that the woman takes, that the female divinity takes. The idea of the dome arching over. And if one thinks about when one stands on the earth and looks up, that the sky looks like a dome. And notice that her body is covered in stars. Okay? So that's the idea of kind of a revelation of what does reality look like with regard to spatial characteristics. Now, we see a much more complicated cosmogony or cosmology on the left-hand side here. And what we see here is something that would have been a little bit more common in literature, like, for example, the Dream of Scipio, works like the Ascension of Isaiah, various Gnostic works from the 2nd and 3rd century, and many other Christian works. In fact, many people have heard the idea that there are 7 heavens. And the concept that we have here is that, of course, you have that the dome of the sky, that has the stars in it, and then you have spheres, concentric spheres that go up and up and up into the heavens, and the realm of God is at the very highest sphere, or that 7th heaven, and in those spheres move the planets. Now, as you read about this, oftentimes it's in that lowest sphere, that lowest kind of dome, the firmament, so to speak, or the sky, where one encounters demonic creatures. It's not the only place that one can encounter them, but many times in the way of thinking about the universe, that's where they would situate the demons. One would often think that the demons, surely they would be found underneath the earth, in a place that we would conceive of as hell. But instead, many of this many of these types of literature conceive of the demonic forces as populating that sky realm or the firmament area. And that's why, for example, in the book of Ephesians in the New Testament talks about we are not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of darkness in high places. Okay, I believe that's chapter 6, verse 12, if my memory is serving me correctly. It's certainly in the letter to the Ephesians, so you can certainly find it there, but I think that's where you would find it specifically. Also, again, if you read the Ascension of Isaiah, which is a Jewish work that has been subsequently Christianized from roughly around the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, it narrates the ascension of Isaiah through these realms that you saw in that slide. And it's in that firmament area that he encounters the demonic spirits that are battling amongst themselves. And they are kind of controlling the powers that be here on earth. One might conceive of it as a puppeteer controls a marionette. That's kind of the conception that's at work there. And you can look up that Ascension of Isaiah by simply Googling it online and finding an older version. It's not going to be the most modern translation, but you can at least find that and kind of read through that ascension. And in that story, it describes how as Isaiah passes through the various spheres of heavens, that he encounters these angelic choirs. And the quality of the angels and the quality even of their singing actually gets better as one moves up through the spheres to eventually get to the throne room of God. And that's a rather interesting conception, but certainly not uncommon in the ancient world, not at all. All right, so with that said, that helps us to understand this definition of the apocalypse. And so I ask you this question. See, that wasn't so bad now, was it? And then right, and you can see the young lady that I have here in the slide. She doesn't look totally convinced of my definition. And I'm assuming that that might be a lot to absorb for the person viewing this class. And so what I'd like to do is try to present it in a different way by giving another example of a piece of literature that you might not think of as being an apocalypse. All right, how about a more modern example of an apocalypse? And I kind of hedge my bet a little bit by saying, well, maybe not so modern. And I'd like to reference a work by one of my favorite more modern authors. Keep in mind, I hang out in the 1st to the 4th century, so for me, a 19th century author is a pretty modern author. Charles Dickens, who lived from the years 1812 to 1870. And one of my favorite works, I've of course read many of his works, as most of us have coming up through school, but one of my favorite works is, of course, A Christmas Carol. And this is a picture of actually the first edition from 1843. Most people might not know this, but originally the Christmas Carol came out in serial format. It was published, in newspaper form, but in pieces. And eventually, when Charles Dickens said that when he eventually wanted to publish it as a book, that he basically paid for the publication himself and actually set the price at a rather low price for the book, where he didn't make a lot of profit in the publication of that first edition. And his reasoning was that he wanted to make it affordable for anybody to buy it, or as many people as possible to buy it. And I think that that probably contributed in no small way to helping to make that Christmas Carol the success that we all know it to be in the here and now. What I'd like to do here is talk about the Christmas Carol and apply that definition of apocalypse to the Christmas Carol. Now, what we have here is firstly the idea of we have a narrative format. I'm taking the definition a little out of order, but that's okay. We'll address each of the issues in turn. A narrative format. We have this. This is a direct quote from the beginning part of the Christmas Carol. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. So clearly Charles Dickens recognizes that this Christmas Carol is in fact going to be a story that is going to be presented and the presentation of the material will be in a story format. Again, no great shakes there. It is in fact revelatory literature. Now, what do we mean by that? I would propose it's revelatory literature for Ebenezer Scrooge. And in a secondary fashion, I think also the readers, or those who hear the story themselves, that they have a certain revelation that is given to them. And one of the key aspects, there's more than one. I mean, I don't want this to devolve into a treatise or a lecture on the Christmas Carol, but just to touch on it, is to say there's certainly more than one bit of revelation that's in the Christmas Carol. But one of the key aspects is the sense of personal responsibility that we all have towards our fellow men and women. And this is an exchange that Scrooge has with two men who are charitable workers who are going around at Christmas time and actually visit Scrooge in his shop and are trying to raise funds for those who are very poor. Scrooge says, "I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." One of the men replies, "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "But you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." So this is an example of Scrooge in need of revelation. He needs to see his own place within the larger reality of the world. And that's precisely what's headed his direction. Now, we see that revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being. Now, of course, everyone thinks of the three ghosts, the ghosts of Christmas past that's pictured here. By the way, if you're not familiar with the story, one of the interesting parts of the Christmas past is that this creature, who's both old and young at the same time, carries with it a cap. You see this is actually an illustration on the right-hand side. The black and white is an illustration that actually comes from the original 1843 edition. There were actually 8 illustrations. We're going to see some of them in this presentation. And one of them is at the end of the revelation that Scrooge experiences from the ghost of Christmas past. And by the way, I'm namely speaking to the fact that he sees that Belle has now another husband. That was the woman that he was in love with as a young man, and that she makes reference to him as to be pitied, to be sorrowful. And of course that offends him and hurts him deeply. And he doesn't want to hear any more of the truth that this ghost of Christmas past has to give to him. And so he takes the cap, that kind of like something that would put out a candle, and he puts it over the head of the ghost of Christmas past in an attempt to kind of blind the light or silence the light or suffocate the light that has come into his life by way of this particular revelatory experience with this otherworldly being. Now, of course, we know of the ghost of Christmas past, and then of course there's 2 other illustrations here that are taken from that original publication. These are by that same artist, John Leech, and we see here depicted the ghost of Christmas present, which is really himself kind of a giant. The first time that he encounters Scrooge, he's actually in one of Scrooge's rooms in his house, and he's set up the entire room as if there was going to be a feast. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we see the depiction of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, where we see the famous experience where he shows the grave, Ebenezer's own grave, to Ebenezer. And Ebenezer is destroyed by this and begs for mercy. Now, obviously, we think of these otherworldly mediators, but what we often forget is that there is one more that appears in the story. And that, of course, is Scrooge's first visitor, Jacob Marley, his partner. And we see this on the left-hand side. This is one of the other illustrations from that original 1843 publication. And then, of course, we have a depiction in a movie with George C. Scott of A Christmas Carol. By the way, it's my personal favorite movie depiction. And I love this Jacob Marley, the depiction that they have of him there. And we see the picture of that particular actor on the right-hand side. Now, we realize that there is a transcendent reality that is revealed by these otherworldly beings. And this is an exchange, part of an exchange between Jacob Marley and Scrooge, and it's one of my favorites. "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness." And so we get this sense that Marley is beginning to unpack for Scrooge that you have a greater responsibility on this earth than taking care of number one. That exchange that you had with those two men in your shop earlier to this day, that was a mistake, my friend. You do not yet understand your place in this reality. And so we find that there is a certain temporal character to this revelation. And the ghost says to him, "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by three spirits." Now Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls one." "Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate." And then finally, it envisages an eschatological salvation. And the salvation, of course, in the Christmas Carol is salvation related to Ebenezer Scrooge. It's for him. But of course, the lesson that is given in this story is intended to be received by all the readers, all the audience. And so the ghost says, "Hear me," cried the ghost, "my time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." "How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell? I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." This is actually one of the little side notes that I actually love about this. I actually discovered this just from rereading it myself, is that according to the story, Marley is behind offering this chance to Ebenezer. So Marley, as lost as he appears to be, he himself is reaching out and trying to change the fate of somebody that he in fact does care about. And I love that aspect of the story. Now, there is a real spatial component to this. Now, obviously, we are well aware, anyone who is a reader of the Christmas Carol is well aware that the temporal component, the past, the present, and the future get the lion's share of the attention, and rightfully so. But one cannot escape the fact that there truly is a spatial dimension to the Christmas Carol, albeit it is kind of folded in and plays certainly a lesser role. Let's take a look and see what I'm referring to here. And this is towards the very end of the encounter between Jacob Marley and Scrooge. "The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the specter reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up his hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The specter, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in his curiosity, he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Wow. This is one of the early drawings from that 1843 book, and it's the depiction of that white waistcoated individual that is seen by Scrooge, who is trying desperately to help a woman with a child, but is unable to reach her, unable to touch her and help her in her need. He had his opportunity in life, but was unwilling to do so. And now in death, his eyes are finally opened, and he sees how he should have intervened and is now unable. And we see here a famous painting by Francis Alexander from 1842, actually 1 year before The Christmas Carol was published, of what Charles Dickens looked like at that time. Now, that said, that's an awful lot to process, but I think that there is some benefit in comparing The Christmas Carol, because it shows that apocalyptic literature continues to inspire and influence us in a myriad of ways. The Apocalypse, the book of Revelation itself, has been an extremely influential book. I mean, it's influenced songs. For example, the Battle Hymn of the Republic that was so important to the Union troops during the Civil War. It's impacted literature, as we'll talk about in later lectures. It has had certainly an impact in movies and in plays. I think of some of the movies that have been made even within the last decade with reference to the book of Revelation. It has an ability to captivate, as it did even in the first century. And I hope that this lecture, in terms of helping people to understand the genre of apocalypse, will help them better encounter the literature and appreciate it even more. God bless, and I thank you for your time and for your attention.